intellectual property in terms of ownership and use and management. Elders met in Navajo Nation a few years ago to deal with the environment and conservation issues like that. And at the end, they wanted to have someone deal with the protection of our intellectual property. So the late Leon Secretero, who was known as their Einstein at Navajo Nation, was assigned to find somebody. And he asked me to do it. So I said, how do you want it done? He said, everything you have in your head is ours. Everything we have in our heads is yours. Nobody owns intellectual property. The people do, and they're granted by the Creator. It's granted by the Creator. Now, when I got back to Canada, Six Nations hosted an international gathering of elders right after that. And I got a call from them, a committee of them, headed up by former Chief Ernie Sundown. He said, we were asked to give you a call. We need to protect our intellectual property. So one of the elders came on and he said, what you have in your head is ours. What we have in our heads is yours. Nobody owns intellectual property, but we got to protect it, and we got to identify how it's going to be used, because so much of our information is being sold and it's also being abused. So that's the status of the intellectual property. And of course, there's protocol that goes along with all that. Then when you look at the information I'm going to be providing on the 4 videos, the Inherent Rights video, the Treaty video, the 500 Years of Colonial Policy video, and the Crown Indian Nations Relations video, that's what I call the Code of Silence. So many of our people and non-Indian people know nothing about what you're going to be hearing today in the videos. So with that, on the inherent rights, and when we look at the issues of inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent title to lands and resources, that impacts on all the Indian people, no matter what nation they belong to or where they come from. And for many of the people that you're going to be representing, they still have all those inherent rights, no matter what the federal law says about Mound status or Métis who are not benefiting today. And I'll explain that later. But when you look at the inherent rights, then we're talking about inherent sovereignty. And we have the national powers of governing as Indian people and Métis and Inuit. And those national powers of governing include powers to govern under your laws and jurisdiction all your internal, external, and international affairs. The self-government policy of the feds is internal control of affairs only. That's not possible. So when we look at the national powers of governing, it includes your powers to govern your citizenship under your jurisdictional laws, your title to land and resources, and so on. I'll list them in a moment. But along with the national powers of governing, then there's also the national powers of treaty making. And I'll highlight that in the video on treaties. But going back now to the inherent rights we have, there's hard copies that I've put together on inherent rights, and they are basically included in this document here. And this is a document that identifies the 4 different categories of inherent rights. Category of political rights, the social rights, the economic rights, and spiritual cultural rights. Now, when you list those rights in terms of inherent sovereignty, it means the inherent right to self-determination. That's what that means. And of course, it includes all those powers I'm talking about. Now, the non-Indians, in looking at how they've done their governing systems, they never had democratic systems of governing. They came from dictatorships. So where did they learn democratic systems of governing from? Well, they learned it from our kinship clan systems. And this is a hard copy of the functions of the clans. And the functions of the clans highlighted and identified what they call today in a modern day concept of a democratic system of governing, the legislative branch of governing, the executive branch of governing, judicial branch of governing, and your administration operations. Now, when we look at that process, then we not only had the kinship clan system, we had portfolios in the form of highly structured and disciplined societies in every sector. The medicine society is an example. It crossed all the boundaries of the nations, right from East Coast to West Coast. And that medicine society provided for them to regulate themselves, and they would meet in neutral territories to provide information on the medicines for preventive medicines and healing medicines, and they exchange medicine. Now, that's just a brief example of our traditional systems of governing. Again, we don't go there to deal with that for implementation and enforcement, but it's all recognized today. Now, when you look at the inherent rights, I'm talking about a listing of those inherent rights that you can identify, and they're inherent rights that includes the inherent rights to your customs, your traditions, values, and practices, and it includes the inherent rights to your system of having inherent rights that are listed in this chart, for example. And when we look at that, there's a hard copy that I'll be providing to you. And when we talk about the inherent rights, then we're talking about your traditions, your customs, your practices, your values, and your beliefs. And they include the inherent rights to the sovereignty of your nation and your government. It includes your inherent rights to education, health, and social development, inherent rights to justice, inherent rights to economics in terms of an economy, and it includes the inherent rights to language, spiritual, cultural affairs. It includes the inherent rights to lands and resources, and certainly includes the inherent rights to citizenship and membership. It includes the inherent rights to water and air, and includes the inherent rights to shelter for homes, and so on. So that gives you some listing of the inherent rights that our nations and peoples have. And the people that you represent have those inherent rights as well. Now, when we look at the source of those inherent rights, the late former Supreme Judge Lammer said, all your rights supersede everything. He said, but I got two questions, he said. What are they and where do they come from? So I just highlighted for you what they are, and they come from the Creator. They're granted to our nations and peoples by the Creator. They come from no other source. They don't come from a treaty, they don't come from a constitution or a law. They're granted to our nations and peoples by the Creator. Now we're caught up in the process of dealing with rights holders, a term coined politically by the feds to divide us even further. No such thing as one chief and council or one band or community only having the rights to what I just highlighted for you. Those are rights that belong to the the nation and the peoples collectively. So how do we implement them then? Well, I listed them for you. We need to define them in our respective languages. Now, you're going to represent people with various languages, but each language has its own philosophy, worldview, traditions, customs, values, practices, and beliefs. And when we look at that process, then we define them, and you go down that list of inherent rights. There's duties and responsibilities that are collective duties and responsibilities of our peoples and our nations and the governments of our nations. Now, when we look at that process, we're not even doing anything about that in terms of teaching the inherent sovereignty of our governments of our nations. We're not doing nothing to teach anything about our inherent rights by sector and our inherent title to lands and resources. People are expected to move on and move forward without that background and information. Can't do it. So we have some responsibility there. Now, when you know your inherent rights, you define them and you identify your duties and responsibilities for each of those inherent rights that are collective responsibilities. What are your plans and strategies then for implementation of each of them? What's your plans for your inherent right to education, your inherent right to your language, your culture, your traditions, your customs, your practices, and your beliefs and values? All those inherent rights. So when we look at that process of dealing with those whole areas of inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, and in that title to lands and resources, when we examine what impacts on them, there's a major impact on our inherent rights that requires us to occupy the field. So you have your plans and strategies now. So what form of unique and special laws do you have to enact through your governing systems? And your structure will have to include institutions and structures of government so that you can officially and formally represent the people that you're representing through your own systems of government and law. Now, that's an area that you'll have to address because I just highlighted for you the inherent rights of the people that you're representing, whether they're status Indians, non-status Indians, or Métis. I tell the Métis, if you don't respect and recognize your inherent rights and your hereditary status as Indian people, then you're missing out a major area of who you are and what you need to do about it. So that basically highlights for you the inherent sovereignty, the inherent rights and title, and the inherent rights by sector, and it's all formally recognized. And in the video on the comprehensive legal political framework governing Crown Indian nations relations, I will identify how they're recognized today and internationally. Now, the UN declaration that's there, people are talking about it and what to do about it. I just gave you the information on what and how we need to do it to implement the UN declaration. If we're sovereign nations and people, and we're entitled to implement and use that declaration, which formally recognizes everything I just highlighted for you. But there's another declaration, and that declaration is known as the Organization of American States Declaration. And that provides a similar recognition to the UN declaration, but we're not using that either. So that's just two instruments that you can use to move forward with the people that you represent. Now, I've given you a full background and information on who you are and who I am, and that's all granted to our nations and our peoples by the Creator. So that's about it for this video.